Listen to the silence. Watch the steady hands of the old man resting on his porch, polishing the glass of an antique watch. It is a perfect golden afternoon, and the only rhythm is the slow, hypnotic ticking of time passing in peace. But time is a liar. Snap your fingers, and the peace is ripped apart by the scream of a city burning alive. Welcome to the kill zone. The air is thick with the copper taste of blood and the deafening rattle of automatic fire. A warlord stands amidst the rubble, surrounded by an army, convinced he is a god, convinced he is untouchable, behind his wall of human shields. He is laughing because he knows no soldier can get within a mile of him. But he doesn't know that 3,000 meters away, a ghost has already stopped his heart. The screen cuts to black. He was dead 6 seconds before he heard the shot. You are about to witness the physics of the impossible, a trigger pull that defied gravity, wind, and the rotation of the earth itself to erase a monster from history. The city wasn't just occupied, it was strangled. Imagine a sprawling labyrinth of crumbling concrete, open sewers, and suffocating tropical heat where the concept of government had ceased to exist 3 years ago. This was a place where the police barricaded themselves inside their own stations, and the streets belonged to the wolves. At the center of this urban rot sat the warlord, a man who didn't just command a gang. He commanded a cult of personality built on absolute terror. He was the apex predator in a concrete jungle, a man who broadcast his executions on social media not just to kill his enemies, but to remind the population that he was God in this zip code. He knew exactly how the Western world operated, and he played the superpowers like a fiddle. He didn't hide in caves or bunkers. He hid behind the beating hearts of the innocent. Every time he moved, he was surrounded by a phalanx of women and children, a human shield that rendered the billion-dollar technology of the United States military completely useless. The frustration in the Situation Room was palpable, a thick, angry tension that tasted like ash. They had the drones. They had the satellites. They had the Hellfire missiles circling in the stratosphere like vultures waiting to dive. But they couldn't pull the trigger. The warlord knew the rules of engagement better than the lawyers did. He weaponized empathy. If the U.S. launched a kinetic strike, they wouldn't just kill him. They would kill 30 orphans and a school teacher, and the footage would be on the evening news before the smoke cleared. Conventional forces had tried and failed in a disastrous raid 6 months prior, a Black Hawk Down scenario that ended with burning armored personnel carriers and a propaganda victory for the gang. Since then, the city had been a fortress, an impregnable no-go zone where the warlord slept soundly, knowing he was untouchable. He moved constantly, a ghost in the machine, never sleeping in the same safe house twice, moving through tunnels and back alleys, always insulated by layers of flesh and blood that the West refused to spill. But arrogance is a slow-acting poison, and eventually everyone makes a mistake. The breakthrough didn't come from a satellite sweep or a drone feed. It came from a burner phone with a cracked screen, smuggled out of the inner circle by a lieutenant who had finally seen too much. The intel was specific, it was time-sensitive, and it was terrifyingly narrow. The warlord was coming out. For the first time in months, he was going to expose himself, stepping onto the rooftop terrace of a repurposed hotel to address his lieutenants and assert his dominance. The intelligence analysts ran the timeline and the blood drained from their faces. The window of opportunity was 5 minutes. 5 minutes where he would be stationary. 5 minutes where he would be visible. But there was a catch, a geographical nightmare that made the generals slam their fists on the table. The hotel was in the dead center of the hostile zone, surrounded by 3 kilometers of dense, hostile favelas packed with armed militia. There was no way to insert a Navy SEAL team without starting a full-scale war. There was no way to get a drone close enough without alerting his jammers. The only secure overwatch position, the only piece of high ground that wasn't crawling with gang members, was a mountain ridge on the outskirts of the city. The tactical officers looked at the topographic map and shook their heads. The distance from the ridge to the hotel rooftop wasn't a gap, it was a canyon. 3,000 meters, 3 kilometers. That is nearly 2 miles of air, wind, humidity, and gravity. In the history of warfare, that wasn't a distance for a sniper rifle. That was a distance for an artillery barrage or an airstrike, but artillery was off the table. They needed a scalpel, not a hammer. They needed to thread a needle from 2 miles away through the chaotic thermals of a burning city to hit a target the size of a dinner plate. It was a shot that physics said shouldn't exist. It was impossible. And that was exactly why they decided to make the call to the one man who had retired from the concept of impossible a long time ago. Man, they came to find, did not live on a grid that existed on any GPS. To find Marcus Thorne, you had to know where the pavement ended and the deep, silent wilderness began. He wasn't hiding exactly. He was simply existing in a frequency that the rest of the world couldn't tune into. Thorne was a ghost story whispered in the mess halls of Quantico and the clandestine briefing rooms of Langley. In the special operations community, there are shooters, there are snipers, and then there is the black ghost. He was a statistical anomaly, a man who had risen through the ranks of a military establishment that had often looked right through him, only to force them to acknowledge that he was the deadliest biological weapon they possessed. He hadn't just broken the color barrier in the elite long-range units. He had shattered it with a single .50 caliber round from a mile away. But Thorne had walked away. He had traded the noise of war for the silence of the mountains, spending his days reloading his own ammunition, weighing every grain of powder with the obsessive precision of a diamond cutter. He was done with killing, or so he thought. The arrival of the government was, as always, intrusive and loud. A black SUV with tinted windows crunched up the gravel driveway, looking like a beetle invading a sanctuary. The man who stepped out was a CIA handler, with soft hands and nervous eyes. Thorne didn't get up from his porch chair. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He had been watching the car for 3 miles through a spotting scope. He knew the suspension was heavy, armored plating. He knew the driver was armed. And he knew they wouldn't be here unless the world was burning down and they had run out of water. The handler walked up the steps, sweating in the heat, holding a secure briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. He looked at Thorne, a man carved out of granite and history, and swallowed hard. There were no pleasantries. There was no small talk. The handler simply unlocked the case, pulled out a tablet, and slid it across the table. Thorne looked at the screen. It wasn't a dossier on a person. It was a topographic map of a city he knew by reputation as a graveyard of empires. Red zones overlaid the streets, and in the center, a blue dot marking a firing position and a red cross marking a target. Thorne looked at the scale of the map. He blinked. He looked again. Then he looked up at the handler with a gaze that could strip paint off a wall. "You're at the wrong house," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "Or you're bad at math. That fearing solution is 3,000 meters. That's not a sniper shot. That's a mortar mission." The handler didn't flinch. "We can't use mortar. Collateral damage. We can't use drones, jammers, and human shields. We need a confirmed kill, single shot, cold bore. We need a magic trick, Marcus. We need the ghost." Thorne picked up the tablet again. He began to run the numbers in his head, a habit he couldn't break. This was his curse. Where others saw a landscape, Thorne saw a matrix of variables. He saw the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, which, at that distance, would pull the bullet inches to the right as the planet spun beneath the projectile during its flight. He saw the spin, drift, the gyroscopic wander of the bullet. He saw the atmospheric density, the humidity, the temperature. At 3,000 meters, nearly 2 miles, a bullet doesn't fly in a straight line. It arcs. It climbs hundreds of feet into the air and then falls like an artillery shell. It enters the transonic zone, where the air becomes unstable, buffering the bullet like a jet breaking the sound barrier. To hit a man-sized target at that distance wasn't marksmanship. It was aerospace engineering performed with a trigger finger. It was chaos theory applied to lead. He thought back to his career. He remembered the doubt in the eyes of his instructors decades ago, the officers who thought a black kid from the inner city didn't have the discipline for the long gun. He remembered outshooting them all, putting rounds through keyholes until they had no choice but to pin the trident on his chest. He remembered the missions that didn't exist, the targets that officially never died. He was the master of the long game. But this was hubris. This was asking a man to throw a rock and hit a coin 2 towns over while a hurricane was blowing. "The target is the warlord," the handler said, sensing Thorne's hesitation. "He's killing families, Marcus. He's executing them on live streams. We have a 5-minute window. 5 minutes where he steps out to preen for his army. If we miss, he goes underground for another year, and thousands die. You are the only person on this planet who has made a shot past 2,500 meters in combat. You're the only one who understands the wind at that altitude. Thorne stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. He looked out at the trees. He wasn't seeing the trees. He was feeling the wind on his skin. He was imagining the flight time. 6 seconds. For 6 whole seconds, the bullet would be alone in the air, helpless against the whims of nature. A gust of wind you couldn't feel at the shooter's position could be raging a mile away, slapping the bullet off course by 10 feet. It was a shot that required a surrender to the elements. It required a level of intuition that bordered on the supernatural. It was a kind of challenge that offended his logic but seduced his ego. It was the impossible calling his name. He turned back to the handler. He looked at the photo of the warlord, a man smiling behind a wall of terrified children. Thorne felt that old, cold, familiar feeling wash over him, the switch flipping from civilian to hunter. He didn't care about the politics. He didn't care about the CIA. He cared about the physics. He cared about the fact that there was a monster who thought he was safe because of distance, and Thorne took that personally. Distance was his domain. Distance was the thing he conquered. "I don't use your rifles," Thorne said, his voice flat. "I use my own, my load, my optics. And I need a spotter who knows calculus better than he knows how to shoot." The handler nodded quickly. "You get whatever you want. We have a bird waiting at the airfield. But Marcus, look at the distance again. The ballistics computer says the hit probability is less than 1%. It says it's impossible." Thorne picked up the tablet and shut it off. The reflection in the black screen showed a man who had gray in his beard but fire in his eyes. He wasn't just a sniper. He was an artist of violence, and he had just been offered his masterpiece. He looked the handler dead in the eye, a faint, predatory smile touching the corner of his mouth. "The math says it's impossible," Thorne said, walking toward the door to pack his gear. "The physics says it's suicide. But you didn't come here for math. You came here for a miracle. When do we leave?" The preparation for a shot of 3,000 meters does not begin with a rifle. It begins with a calculator. In a safe house converted into a ballistics laboratory, Marcus Thorne stood over a workbench that looked less like a sniper's station and more like the clean room of an aerospace firm. The weapon lying disassembled on the anti-static mat was not a standard-issue military rifle. It was a custom-built monstrosity, a .408 JTAC intervention platform that had been stripped down and rebuilt by Thorne's own hands. The barrel was 30 inches of fluted, cryogenically treated steel, heavy enough to anchor a small boat. The chassis was a skeleton of aerospace-grade aluminum. But the heart of the system was the optic. The scope mounted on the top rail cost more than most American family homes. It was a Schmidt and Bender PM2 with a custom reticle, a piece of glass so pristine it could theoretically distinguish the color of a man's tie from 2 miles away. But looking through it was the easy part. The hard part was the ammunition. Thorne wasn't using factory bullets. At this distance, factory tolerances were lethal errors. He was hand-loading his own rounds, weighing every grain of slow-burning propellant on a digital scale sensitive enough to detect the weight of a fingerprint. The projectiles were solid copper, lathe-turned monoliths designed to slice through the air with a ballistic coefficient that defied drag. Thorne picked up one of the cartridges. It felt heavy, cold, and menacing. It wasn't just a bullet. It was a miniature rocket without an engine. It had to remain supersonic for over 2 seconds, and then, crucially, it had to survive the transonic barrier, the chaotic moment when a bullet slows down to the speed of sound and begins to wobble. Most bullets tumble at that range. Thorne needed his to glide. Beside him stood his spotter, a man known only as Miller. If Thorne was the trigger, Miller was the brain. Miller held a Kestrel weather meter in one hand and a hardened military tablet in the other. They weren't just checking the wind, they were building a climate model. At 3,000 meters, the environment is not singular. It is a series of microclimates. The wind at the muzzle might be blowing 5 miles per hour from the east, but at the apex of the bullet's flight, where it would soar hundreds of feet into the air, the wind might be blowing 20 miles per hour from the west. And down at the target, 3 kilometers away, the air might be dead still. They had to calculate the sum of these contradictions. Miller looked at the data stream. Humidity was 80%. Barometric pressure was dropping. Every single digit mattered. If they miscalculated the air density by 1%, the bullet would miss the target by 10 feet. But the wind was just the beginning of the nightmare. Thorne began to input the data into his mental firing solution, grappling with forces that standard infantrymen never even consider. He had to account for the Coriolis effect. The target was 3,000 meters away. The flight time of the bullet would be roughly 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, the Earth would rotate beneath the bullet. The target wasn't standing still. The planet was moving him. If Thorne aimed directly at the warlord, the rotation of the Earth would pull the target several inches to the right before the bullet arrived. He had to lead the target not because the man was moving, but because the world was turning. Then there was the spin drift, the physical torque of the bullet spinning at thousands of revolutions per second, which would naturally cause it to drift to the right, regardless of the wind. Thorne and Miller moved to the simulation range, a digital setup designed to synchronize their biological rhythms. This was the Vulcan-mind meld. At 3 kilometers, the beat of Thorne's heart was a seismic event. If he pulled the trigger during a systolic contraction, the thump of the heart pumping blood, the microscopic vibration would translate to a miss of 3 meters at the target end. He had to shoot between heartbeats. He had to exist in the silence between the pulse. Miller watched Thorne's breathing, calling out the rhythm. Breathe in, hold, exhale, pause. They did this for an hour, syncing their minds until Miller didn't even have to speak. Thorne could feel the spotter's rhythm. Finally, they moved to the dry fire drill. Thorne lay prone behind the massive rifle, settling the stock into his shoulder pocket. He looked through the scope. This was the moment that broke the brains of amateur shooters. At 3,000 meters, gravity is a dictator. The bullet drops like a stone. To hit a target that far away, you don't aim at him, you aim at the sky. Thorne cranked the elevation turret on his scope. Click, click, click. He spun the dial until it wouldn't spin anymore, adding over 100 minutes of angle to the barrel. He looked through the lens. The crosshair wasn't resting on the silhouette of the target. It was resting on a cloud formation floating hundreds of feet above the simulated horizon. "Check elevation," Thorne grunted, his voice flat. "Elevation confirmed," Miller replied, his eyes glued to the ballistic computer. "You are lobbing a mortar shell, Marcus." "You're throwing a Hail Mary pass." Thorne adjusted his focus. It was the absurdity of the physics that made him smile. He was aiming at empty air. He was going to fire a piece of copper into the blue sky, trusting that gravity, drag, and 6 seconds of flight time would arc that projectile down into a parabolic curve that would terminate exactly where the warlord's chest would be. It wasn't shooting. It was high-speed mathematics. It was faith in the cold, hard rules of the universe. He racked the bolt, the massive action sliding home with a metallic clack that echoed like a vault door closing. The preparation was done. The math was solid. Now they just had to carry this heavy, hateful machine into the heart of a hostile city, set it up without being seen, and pray that the wind didn't change its mind. The insertion into the hostile zone did not begin with a helicopter fast rope or the roar of an armored convoy. It began with the slide of a manhole cover being lifted millimeters at a time, moving with the agonizing slowness of a tectonic plate. Marcus Thorne and his spotter, Miller, ascended from the sewers like primordial creatures dragging themselves out of the muck. They were coated in a layer of filth that smelled of sulfur rot and human waste, a deliberate olfactory camouflage designed to mask the scent of gun oil and American soap. They were 3 kilometers from the target, deep in the sprawling shanty town that ringed the city like an infected wound. This was the Red Zone, a labyrinth of corrugated tin shacks and narrow alleys, where the warlord's militia patrolled with the twitchy aggression of methamphetamine addicts, carrying the disassembled .408 Chaytak rifle. In a drag bag that weighed 60 pounds was a physical torture test. Every muscle in Thorne's body screamed for relief, but his mind was a sheet of ice. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a shadow. They moved through the ruins of an industrial park that had been shelled into oblivion during the last coup. The darkness was absolute, save for the erratic flickering of streetlights wired into the stolen power grid. Thorne moved with a fluid, rolling gait, placing the outside edge of his boot down first to roll the foot inward, silencing the crunch of gravel. Miller followed in his wake, moving in perfect sync. They were ghosts passing through a graveyard. Suddenly Thorne froze. He didn't drop to a knee. He simply ceased to be a moving object, blending perfectly into a pile of rubble. 5 meters away, a technical, rusted Toyota pickup with a heavy machine gun, welded to the bed, rolled slowly around the corner. The vehicle stopped. The engine idled with a rough, choking cough. 2 militia members hopped out, their AK-47s slung low and loose. They were kids, barely 20 years old, laughing and lighting cigarettes. The flare of the match illuminated their faces, hollowed out by drugs and war. They were standing so close that Thorne could smell the cheap tobacco smoke drifting on the humid night air. He lay motionless under a piece of tarp, his hand resting on the grip of his suppressed pistol. He controlled his breathing, forcing his heart rate down, willing his pores not to sweat. If these kids looked down, if they saw the glint of a watch or the outline of a boot, the mission would turn into a bloodbath. Thorne would have to kill them, and the noise would bring the entire favela down on their heads. The seconds stretched into hours. The militiamen finished their cigarettes, flicking the butts into the darkness, one landing inches from Miller's face. They laughed again, climbed back into the truck, and drove off, the heavy tires crunching over the debris. Thorne didn't move until the taillights had vanished. Then, like a phantom, he rose and continued the ascent. Their destination was a skeletal relic of the old city, a massive rusted water tower perched on a limestone ridge overlooking the valley. It was the highest point in the sector, a jagged metal crown that offered the only line of sight to the warlord's hotel 3 kilometers away. But getting up there was a climb into hell. The ladder was corroded, the metal flaking away under their gloves. The wind whipped around the structure, threatening to tear them from the rungs. With 80 pounds of gear on their backs, every upward step was a battle against gravity. When they finally reached the catwalk, 80 feet above the ridge, they didn't celebrate. They went to work. They had to construct the hide. This wasn't just a matter of lying down. They had to build a fortress of invisibility. They chose a spot beneath the rusted underbelly of the tank, where the shadows were deepest. They draped sniper netting over the railing, breaking up the hard lines of the rifle barrel. They cleared the floor of loose debris that might kick up dust when the massive muzzle brake vented the gas. Thorne assembled the rifle in the dark, his fingers moving with the memory of 1,000 repetitions. The barrel clicked into the receiver. The bolt slid home. The massive optical scope was mounted and torqued to spec. When the sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple, the true nightmare began. The heat. The water tower was essentially a metal oven. As the tropical sun hammered the steel, the temperature inside the hide rocketed to 110 degrees. There was no breeze in their sheltered nook. The air was stagnant and heavy. Thorne lay prone behind the rifle, sweat stinging his eyes, soaking his camouflage fatigues until they clung to him like a second skin. He couldn't wipe his face. Movement was death. Across the valley, 3,000 meters away, the city was waking up. Through the powerful magnification of the Schmidt and Bender scope, Thorne could see the heat waves, the mirage rising from the concrete jungle. It made the target area shimmer and dance like a reflection in a pool of water. "Range check," Thorne whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Miller, lying beside him with the spotting scope, didn't look up. "Range is 3012 meters. Humidity 90%. Barometric pressure steady. Wind is chaotic. I've got a full value left to right at the muzzle, but downrange, looking at the smoke from those burning tires, it looks like a headwind." This was the variable that terrified them. The wind was fighting itself. The bullet would have to punch through multiple air currents, each one trying to slap it off course. Thorne adjusted his turret, dialing in the elevation. He was aiming at a ghost. The warlord wasn't there yet. They were waiting for a schedule that was based on stolen intel and hope. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The heat became a physical weight, pressing them into the metal grating. Dehydration began to set in, a dull headache throbbing at the base of Thorne's skull. He focused on his breathing, entering a meditative trance to slow his metabolism. Inhale, exhale, wait, and then the crisis hit. "Time?" Thorne asked. 1,000 hours, Miller replied, tension creeping into his voice. "He's late. Intel said he steps out at 9:45 for his morning address." Thorne looked through the scope. The rooftop terrace of the hotel was empty. There were guards, yes, tiny figures patrolling the perimeter, but the target was missing. Had the intel been wrong? Had the warlord changed his routine? Or worse, had they been compromised? "Check comes," Thorne ordered. "Get an update from the handler." Miller reached for the secure satellite radio. He keyed the mic. Nothing. He checked the display. The power light was blinking a frantic red. "Battery failure," Miller hissed. "The heat, it cooked the cells. We're losing signal. I can't reach command." Thorne didn't move his eye from the scope. He was staring down a 3-kilometer tunnel at an empty stage. They were alone, cut off, sitting on top of a metal tower in enemy territory, with a rifle that sounded like a cannon, waiting for a man who wasn't there. The wind picked up, whistling through the grating, mocking them. If the warlord didn't show in the next few minutes, they would have to make a choice: abort the mission and try to fight their way back through the sewers, or stay and risk being discovered by the drone patrols that were starting to buzz over the favela. Thorne's finger rested on the trigger guard, hovering over the cold metal. The impossible shot was slipping away, dissolving into the heat haze and the silence of a radio that had just died. The sun was no longer a celestial body. It was a hammer striking an anvil, and Marcus Thorne was the metal being forged. On top of the water tower, the temperature had climbed past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel grating beneath him was searing hot, radiating heat through his drag bag and into his chest. Sweat didn't drip anymore. It evaporated instantly, leaving a crust of salt on his skin that itched maddeningly. A horsefly, drawn by the smell of human salt, landed on his eyelid. It crawled across his lashes, its legs tickling the sensitive skin. Thorne didn't blink. He didn't twitch. He had retreated into the sniper's bubble, a mental state of suspended animation where pain is just data to be acknowledged and then ignored. He forced his breathing to shallow, rhythmic tides, slowing his metabolic rate until his heart was beating only 40 times a minute. Thump, pause, thump. He was a biological machine waiting for an input signal. His body was screaming. A cramp was knotting in his right calf, a hard ball of muscle threatening to spasm and shake his entire aim. He visualized the muscle relaxing, forcing his will upon his anatomy. Beside him, Miller was suffering in silence, his eyes glued to the spotting scope, his face a mask of red, sunburned misery. They had been in position for 4 hours. The water in their hydration bladders was hot enough to brew tea. The world through the scope was a swimming, boiling soup of mirage. The heat waves rising from the 3 kilometers of concrete between them and the target distorted the air, making straight lines look like wiggling snakes. It was the sniper's worst enemy. It made reading the wind nearly impossible because the optical distortion masked the subtle movements of vegetation. And then, movement. "Target area active," Miller whispered, his voice cracking from dehydration. "Door is opening." "I see." Security detail. 4 pox. Heavy weapons. Thorne's eye sharpened. He didn't tense up. He loosened. He let the image wash over him. Through the high-powered Schmidt and Bender scope, he saw the rooftop terrace of the hotel 3,000 meters away. It looked like a hazy dream, but the shapes were distinct. Armed men in fatigues fanned out. Then the human shields. Women and children, terrified and weeping, were shoved out onto the balcony, forming a living wall. It was a grotesque display of cowardice that made Thorne's finger tighten microscopically on the trigger guard. "Target in sight," Miller said. "It's him. The warlord." The warlord stepped out. He was wearing a white linen suit that stood out starkly against the gray concrete and the olive drab of his soldiers. He looked small at this distance, a tiny white speck in a chaotic world. He walked to the edge of the balcony, parting the wall of human shields like a king parting the Red Sea. He stood there, leaning on the railing, looking out over his kingdom, smiling. He felt safe. He looked at the sky, checking for drones. He saw nothing. He looked at the streets. He saw submission. He didn't look at the rusted water tower 3 kilometers away on the hazy horizon. "Range 3,100 meters, Miller recited, his voice turning robotic. "Elevation dialed, spindrift accounted for. Coriolis is 0.4 mils, right?" Thorne adjusted the turret. Click, click. The crosshair settled. He was aiming not at the warlord, but at a point in the empty air 12 feet above the man's head and 4 feet to the left. He was aiming at a phantom coordinate where the bullet would intercept the target in 6 seconds. "Wind check," Thorne said. Miller paused. He looked at the kestrel meter. He looked at the smoke rising from a burning tire pile halfway down the valley. He looked at the laundry flapping on a line in the favela. "Wind is bad, Marcus?" "It's gusting." "I've got 5 miles per hour at the muzzle, left to right. But at mid-range, I'm seeing debris blowing right to left at 15. It's a crosswind shear, turbulence. Thorne watched the mirage. It was boiling violently. The air was unstable. If he fired now, the bullet would be slapped around like a paper airplane in a hurricane. It could miss by 20 feet. It could hit a child. No shot, Miller said, the words heavy with defeat. I repeat, no shot. Conditions are red. Thorne held his breath. He watched the warlord. The man was checking his watch. He was bored. He turned to say something to a lieutenant. He was getting ready to go back inside. The window was closing. They had endured the hell of the climb, the torture of the heat, and the failure of the radio for this one moment. And now the atmosphere itself was denying them. The warlord took a step back from the railing. He waved a hand, dismissing his guards. He was leaving. He's moving, Thorne whispered. Give me the call, Miller. I can't, Miller hissed. The wind is shifting every 2 seconds. If you send it, it's a gamble. We don't gamble. Thorne watched the white suit turn away. The mission was failing before his eyes. The warlord would go back underground, and the killing would continue. Thorne felt a surge of cold fury. He expanded his awareness, reaching out with his senses. He watched the flags on the distant shacks. He watched the dust on the ridge. Suddenly the world seemed to hold its breath. The flapping laundry in the favela went limp. The smoke from the tire fire stopped bending and rose straight up in a gray pillar. The wind at the water tower died, the howling gust fading into a spooky silence. The chaotic boil of the mirage settled into a steady shimmer. It was a let-off, a momentary gap in the weather systems, a freak occurrence where the turbulence canceled itself out. Wind is down, Miller gasped, seeing the numbers drop on his meter. Wind is 0, 0 at muzzle. Mid-range is calm. You have the window. Send it now. Thorne didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He became the rifle. The crosshair was floating high above the warlord's head, aiming at the empty blue sky. The warlord stopped, turning back for one last look at the city. He presented his chest. The universe had aligned for a fraction of a second. Thorne exhaled half his breath, reached the natural pause in his respiratory cycle, and applied 3 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The firing pin struck the primer. The powder ignited, and the impossible began its journey. The sear broke crisp and clean, like a glass rod snapping in the frost. The explosion that followed was a controlled catastrophe. The 408 Chaytak cartridge detonated with the force of a hand grenade contained within a steel chamber, sending a shock wave through the chassis of the rifle that slammed into Thorne's shoulder with the kick of a mule. The massive muzzle brake vented the superheated gases sideways, kicking up a cloud of dust and rust from the water tower floor, momentarily obscuring the world. But Thorne didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He rode the recoil, keeping his eye welded to the scope, waiting for the picture to settle. The bullet left the barrel at 3,000 feet per second, screaming into the void. It was a solid copper solid, a lathe-turned needle designed to cheat the air, but now it was alone. For the next 6 seconds, Marcus Thorne was no longer in control. Physics was the driver. The bullet didn't fly straight. It climbed. Because of the extreme elevation Thorne had dialed in, the projectile soared upward, arcing high above the favelas, rising hundreds of feet into the tropical sky. It climbed past the birds, past the smoke of the tire fires, entering the thinner, cooler air of the upper trajectory. To an observer on the ground, it would have looked like he had fired at a cloud, a prayer tossed into the heavens. 1 second. The bullet was still climbing, spinning at over 200,000 revolutions per minute. The gyroscopic stability kept it point forward, drilling a hole through the atmosphere. 2 seconds. It reached its apex, the highest point of its parabolic arc. For a microscopic moment, it hung suspended in the blue sky, suspended between the violence of the launch and the inevitability of the fall. This was the quietest moment. The roar of the rifle was far behind it now. It was a silent, spinning angel of death, looking down at the city 3 kilometers below. 3 seconds. Gravity took hold. The nose of the bullet tipped downward, beginning the long, accelerating slide back to Earth. This was the danger zone. The bullet was crossing through the invisible layers of the atmosphere, fighting the crosswinds that Miller had warned about. A sudden thermal updraft from the hot tin roofs of the shantytown buffeted the projectile, trying to push it high. The spin drift pulled it gently to the right, and beneath it, the massive, silent rotation of the Earth moved the target. The hotel rooftop was literally moving out of the way, inch by inch, as the planet spun on its axis. But Thorne's math held. He had aimed at empty space, and now the Earth was moving the warlord into the path of the falling lead. 4 seconds. The bullet was picking up speed in its descent, but it was also losing energy. It was approaching the transonic barrier, that turbulent, shaky threshold where the air creates a shock wave that can destabilize the flight. It shuddered, fighting the drag, but the custom aerodynamics of the copper solid held true. It sliced through the turbulence like a knife. 5 seconds. The warlord, 3,000 meters away, was still smiling. He was turning his head to speak to his lieutenant. He was alive. He was powerful. He was safe. His brain was processing the sunlight, the smell of the city, the feeling of the linen suit on his skin. He had absolutely no idea that he was already dead. The bullet was 100 meters away now, closing the gap faster than the speed of sound. The sound of the gunshot, the crack of the rifle, was still kilometers behind, struggling to catch up. The death would arrive in total silence. 6 seconds. The impact was not a puncture. It was a collision. The heavy, high-velocity projectile struck the warlord in the upper chest, just left of the sternum. The energy transfer was catastrophic. At that speed, the hydrostatic shock didn't just tear tissue, it liquefied it. The bullet passed through him in a fraction of a millisecond, expanding and tumbling, blowing a massive exit, wound out the back of the white linen suit. The warlord didn't crumble. He was thrown. The kinetic energy lifted him off his feet and slammed him backward onto the concrete of the terrace. The smile was slapped off his face before his brain could even register the pain. He hit the ground dead, his heart destroyed. His power evaporated in a pink mist that hung in the humid air. For a heartbeat, there was silence on the rooftop. The guards stood frozen, staring at the body of their invincible leader, which lay broken and ruining the pristine white suit. They didn't hear a shot. They didn't see a flash. It was as if God himself had reached down and flicked him off the board. Then the panic set in. The human shields screamed and scattered. The lieutenants drew their weapons, spinning in circles, aiming at the surrounding rooftops, aiming at the sky, shouting orders that no one followed. And then, nearly 8 seconds after Thorne had pulled the trigger, the sound arrived. A dull, distant thump rolled over the city, a ghostly echo that sounded like thunder from a storm that wasn't there. It was the report of the rifle finally completing its 3-kilometer journey, a tombstone arriving after the funeral. Back on the water tower, the recoil had settled. Thorne watched through the scope. He saw the pink mist. He saw the white suit turn red. He saw the chaos erupting on the terrace like an kicked anthill. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He exhaled the breath he had been holding for an eternity. "Target down," Miller whispered, his voice shaking with the release of tension. "Impact confirmed. Center mass." "The king is dead." Thorne didn't linger to admire the work. The spell was broken. The sniper's bubble popped, replaced by the frantic urgency of survival. That bullet trail, visible as a distortion in the air, pointed straight back to their position. The math that had killed the warlord could easily be reversed by anyone with a ballistic computer and a mortar team. "Pack it up," Thorne ordered, standing up and breaking the seal of the heat. "We have 3 minutes before they figure out where that came from." He began to strip the rifle, his hands moving with a blur of practiced speed. The barrel came off. The scope went into the padded case. The brass casing, still smoking on the metal grate, was snatched up and pocketed, leaving no evidence. They were no longer hunters. They were prey in a city that had just woken up angry. Thorne took one last look at the distant hotel, now just a shimmering heat signature in the distance. The impossible had been done. The 6 seconds were over. Now they just had to survive the run home. The extraction was not a retreat. It was a magic trick. Thorne and Miller didn't run. They evaporated. Within 90 seconds of the kill shot, the massive .408 Chaytak was broken down into its component parts and stowed in the drag bags. They rappelled down the internal maintenance shaft of the water tower, sliding down the rusted cables into the darkness of the ridge, just as the first sirens began to wail in the city below. They were ghosts moving through the scrub brush, turning their backs on the chaos they had ignited. "10 minutes later, as they reached the extraction point in the dense jungle canopy at the base of the ridge, the air behind them tore open. The gang's heavy weapons teams, having triangulated the likely firing position, unleashed a barrage of RPGs and mortar fire on the water tower. The metal structure groaned and twisted. collapsing in a fiery heap of steel and steam. Thorne didn't look back at the explosion. He knew the timing. If they had stayed to high-five, they would be dead. They vanished into the tree line, melting into the green, leaving nothing behind but a collapsed tower and a headless organization. The aftermath was absolute. Without the warlord, the cult of personality crumbled overnight. The lieutenants turned on each other, fighting for scraps of power, fracturing the gang into ineffective, warring tribes that were easily swept up by the emboldened conventional forces. The city, strangled for years, took its first breath of freedom. But the shot itself became a phantom. The official report was redacted in black ink, buried in a sub-basement at Langley. The media reported a gas explosion or an internal coup, but in the dark corners of the internet, on military forums and in the whispers of special operations bars, the legend grew. They talked about the 3-kilometer shot. They talked about the black ghost who could kill you from a different zip code. Some said it was a drone. Others said it was a satellite laser. No one believed a human being could hold a crosshair steady against the rotation of the earth and drop a piece of copper into a man's chest from 2 miles away. It was technically impossible. It was a myth. And the myth is sitting on his porch right now. The sun has set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Marcus Thorne snaps the case of his antique watch closed. Click. The sound is loud in the quiet evening. He looks out at the horizon, past the trees, past the peace of his retirement. He isn't looking at the scenery. He is looking at the physics of the world. He feels the wind on his cheek, and instinctively he calculates the hold. He feels the spin of the planet beneath his feet. He knows secrets that would shatter the history books. He knows that the impossible is just a math problem waiting to be solved by the right man with the right will. He closes his eyes, savoring the silence, a silence he bought with 6 seconds of perfection. He is the keeper of the record that doesn't exist. He is the man who proved that no matter how far you run, or how many walls you build, you are never out of range. History is filled with these moments, shots fired in the dark, missions that never happened, and heroes who were erased from the narrative. The official story is a comfortable lie, but the truth is out there, hiding in the ballistics and the blood. If you want to uncover the missions they tried to bury, if you want to see the impossible made real, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel. Join us as we open the classified files and look down the scope at the history you were never supposed to see, because the distance doesn't matter. The truth always hits the target.